always found College Park to be a very hospitable place for pilots flying in from other places. There used to be a runway that went this way. And my first flight out of here as a scared young man, not dreaming I'd become a pilot, was a friend of mine he said, "Hey, one Sunday afternoon, let's go to the airport." All right. I like airplanes, but I was really scared of them for some reason. And so he says, "Hey, look, they're giving a ride for like $4. Let's go." I said, "Oh, come on. I'll pay for it. Come on." So we hopped on the plane, and Brinkerhoff took us around, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes, and we landed, and my buddy said, "Wasn't that great?" I was scared.
I got into flying when I was in the Army, and I was involved in the testing and usage of what at the time was fairly new to the Army, airborne electronic surveillance equipment. And so the pilot showed me how a little bit to fly. And so I thought that this would be neat. So after I got out and was able to save enough money, which was 10 years later, well, 8, then I started to learn to fly. And I got my private pilot's and my commercial license in 1969, 1970. So I've been flying a long time. I'm 80 years old. So I was in the Army when I was 19 or 20 years old. So I got my pilot's license, I guess, when I was around 30.
When the museum opened in 1998, right? September, yeah. So until we shut down, I was a fairly active volunteer. Well, the last couple of years I wasn't so active, but.
So you've been volunteering for the past?
Since it opened, yeah.
Nice.
So what, over 20 years? Oh yeah, over 20 years.
My name is Bob Kowalczyk. I was a teacher here in the county for 32 years, junior high and senior high. And then I proceeded to work here as a volunteer.
Hi. I'm Mark Hulk, the facility. We running?
Hey, you're good.
All right.
Go for it.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
No worries.
Facilities manager here at the College Park Aviation Museum. Started working at the museum in February of 1998. I was part of the staff that opened up the museum, and we opened the following September of 1998. So, yeah, it's been a
Couple
long
of years.
career. It's a few years here. Long career, yeah.
So they sent out a mailing or something. I'm involved in the Prince George's County Historical Society, and I think they sent a mailing out to them, maybe the Prince George's County Historical and Cultural Trust, which is also another organization I was involved in. And I saw it and I said, I didn't know anything about it. And with my dad being a pilot, and my mom was a flight attendant for a little while, I said to Mom, hey, you want to go volunteer? And so we ended up coming to the museum and going through the, what is that called? I guess the introduction. I mean, no matter when you came in, I mean, the weekends were always, had the families come in, and, they enjoyed playing out on the little tarmac area with the pedal planes and all that other stuff, and then the various exhibits in the museum. So yeah, and I've watched the museum evolve and change over the years.
It was a whole different feeling then. I think it was a lot more laid back. I can still remember times when pilots that were here for many years just kept their planes. They fly whenever they wanted to. Weekends were busy, but if there was nothing for someone just to come hang out and talk with the airport staff and have a cup of coffee, and then they say, I'm going to go up for a few hours or just for a short fly, just to take off, and they'd be back. And quite a few of them had been here for quite a few years as well, so they felt that it was a part of their home and felt very comfortable with the staff here. Just they're flying. Many of them had probably been flying for years. Probably quite a few of them were old World War II veterans and just people that had just probably been around since the Brinkerhoff years here at the airport. So it's quite a few years.
Okay.
The airfares were really a big thing. An annual event generally held in September. Early on they were a 2-day event, but eventually just became a 1-day event. But it was an all-day affair, involved air shows and different static aircraft. You could take a helicopter flight, Stearman flight, had a lot of different things for the children, families in general. Pretty good crowds, upwards to hundreds of people, thousands on the days when, you know, we counted two people here, 2 years, sorry, two-day events. So yeah, we used to get quite the crowds, and people looked forward to it every year as well. We would get phone calls for many years after we had stopped having them, and they were like, "Oh, are you having your annual airfare?" I had to unfortunately tell them that we couldn't have them after 9/11. So that's one of the things of many things that changed after 9/11 here.
The difference in time between Parker Planning taking it over and setting up what they're running down there and the implementation of the Parker Planning rules was they greatly restricted the ability to fly. And they basically said you can only fly from dawn until dusk or something similar. So basically you had a very short day, that no plane weighing more than, now I may have this wrong, it's been a long time, but 4,000 pounds could be based at the field. No helicopters could be based at the field, and no primary instruction could originate at the field. The planning changed the rules, and they changed the word from actually, I don't remember the exact wording, but they changed it so that there was no longer any instruction allowed whatsoever at the field. I can't tell you when. Private piloting, pleasure of flying took off. And I forget how many times the rules were changed, but when Parker Planning put in that first set of rules I told you about, they limited the number of planes on the field to 76, which was the number of planes that were based on the field at the time. Number of planes that could fly and could be based here. There's never been a restriction on the number of planes that could fly in and out of the airport, but to be based here, to have a tie-down here, that's always been in the rules. So they upped it to some number which I don't remember. But there was still further pressure on the field, so they increased it to 120. And they put in a special provision that if you had a classic or an antique plane, you could move to the top.
Hey, this is ad in the paper. Somebody wants to, if you got Earl Coop experience, please call. I didn't do anything. The next week it was there again, and she says, if you don't call, I'm going to call. Yes, dear, I'll call. And so I called and the guy said, well, can you meet me over at the flight operations building, which was then a little, couple of those school classrooms put together. And I met this gentleman, John Lehman, who was the head of the shop. It wasn't anybody else. He was in the shop. And he was an architectural engineer and a pilot. But he was probably late 60s, early 70s. And he said, I showed up and he walked me over to we met at the operations building, he walked me over to the shop where the picture you saw was just bare. He says, we're having a problem trying to figure out how to get this broken window out of this airplane. And I said, give me a small screwdriver. And there were two little plates. And they put the plates out and I slid through in there and handed it to him. And he said, can you come back next week? He'd take off for freeway and just fly straight across here, as long as you didn't go to the White House. Or as I said before, you could fly over Andrews Field at 2,000 feet. You could fly over the district at 1,500 feet, anywhere except over the White House. And life was a lot simpler. You could get in your airplane and you could fly virtually anywhere, with rare exception. In the Washington area, there was a prohibited area over the White House. There may have been one over the Naval Observatory. You can understand why there, because they don't want to take pictures of airplanes flying. But anywhere else in the Washington area, if you flew at 1,500 feet and just mind your P's and Q's, you could fly right over the city. And I did many times. Even more than that, if based at Freeway Airport, a lot of our pilots would fly over to Hyde Field where there was a restaurant. There was nothing like a restaurant on an airport. It was just wonderful. With the rules in effect then, you could fly right over Andrews Field at 2,000 feet, and it was okay. Just trying to show you how welcoming the skies were at that time. However, let's move on to 9/11. Like a lot of people, I was, on that particular day, I was in the kitchen, probably finished eating, probably doing the dishes, if I could recall, and they interrupted the program that my wife was listening to. And he said, we have a bulletin here, an airplane has crashed into the World Trade Center. And I looked at her, I said, this happened before. She said, what do you mean it happened before? I said, when I was a kid in junior high school, going into 8th grade, a B-25 ran into the Empire State Building and killed 3 crew members and I think 14 people in the building. I think it hit something like the 63rd floor, somewhere in there. But it was because the weather was very bad and the pilots actually were lost. But the cardinal rule, unfortunately, that was disobeyed. If you know the highest obstacle, stay above it. And they did. They were searching for a particular slot to sort of, there's 2 rivers there, and he thought he was on Mud River. He was on the other river. And led him to the cleaning course. And of course, he told him, I think 70 people died.
I guess you were asking me what I was doing in 911. Of course, this was something mysterious that occurred. I am a docent down at the Air and Space Museum in Washington, and I was supposed to take a Chicago congressman on a tour. My boss called me and said, don't come in until about 11 o'clock because this is when the congressman is free. Well, 15 minutes later, he called me up again and said, take a look at your television, see what's happened. Don't come in at all. Of course, I saw the buildings going down and all the disaster that occurred there. So I never did go downtown. But I understand the whole town just virtually emptied out and caused a great traffic problem on Kenilworth Avenue and, of course, Route 1 and a few others. And that's all. It's not a whole lot. I didn't do a whole lot about it all.
So at the time the first plane hit the tower, one of my colleagues came into my office and said, have you heard? And it's like, no. And they told me, and I was actually being poor taste now and bad reaction was, oh, I guess the pilot didn't have his coffee that morning. And then a little while later, somebody said, oh, another plane went into the towers. And at that point, it's like we knew something was going on. One of my colleagues was coming in and, had said that, there was a plane over by the White House and security, the Secret Service? And security there was telling people around the White House to leave, get away from the building. That's when we started hearing about the Pentagon possibility. We were actually, somebody, a lot of my colleagues were outside. It was prime coffee break time is when all this was happening. And, somebody said, well, they heard a boom at some point, not having any idea what that boom related to. And my boss started walking around the offices, and this was probably about 10 o'clock in the morning, give or take, and said, go home, just leave, because we didn't know what was happening. And we had not gotten any direction from our senior management at the agency. So my boss just told people to go. And so I knew a couple of my colleagues who lived nearby who could give me a ride home because I did not want to go through the center of town on Metro to get back home because didn't know what was going on.
Sure.
And when we got down to the garage, the security in the garage wouldn't let us out of the building. So it's like, okay, fine. So went back upstairs, and like less than 5 minutes later, that all changed. Things were happening very quickly. And by that time, I had separated from the colleagues I was going to ride with, and never could catch back up with them. Too bad I didn't, because they left before the madhouse traffic jams in downtown DC, and they were back home by 11 a.m. It's like, okay, I wasn't as familiar with the outer metro stations. I grew up on the blue and orange line, and I had no clue, how to get to the yellow line or the red line or something like that to try and get out of town some other way. So I ended up running into another colleague as we were all milling around outside, and I asked him how he was going home, since I knew he lived here in northern Prince George's. And he said, well, he's going to go walk to one of the outer yellow green line stations. So we ended up, I said, well, can I join you? Because I started thinking, Well, if I go on the yellow-green line, I can come out here to College Park. Walk from the station over here to the museum. Then ask, see if somebody at the museum could give me a ride to my car, or I could call my parents to come pick me up. And so that's what we ended up doing. And it's just like, I know the entire ride out here, we kept waiting to see what was going to happen on the train, whether there's going to be some incident that prevented us from moving forward. And finally I got here. We walked, I guess, I think it was the convention center station, which was, 6-7 blocks from my office. And it was a hot day. Of course, it was one of those days where I was in a suit and heels. So the walk was not comfortable, let's put it that way. It was a little miserable. And we just watched the traffic jam. I mean, everywhere we were, cars were just stalled trying to get out of the city. And I mean, it happened very quickly. Within an hour that the city was in gridlock. Cell phones, we couldn't call out. I mean, I was able to get an initial call out to my parents from my office to say, hey, I'm leaving and I'll call you when I get home. After that, cell phones didn't work, even landlines weren't working. And like I said, I finally got to College Park. I walked over here and I walked in the door, and when people saw me, they said, oh my God, you're okay. They were very happy to see that I was okay. And I got a bunch of hugs and, can I get you anything? And the first thing I want, water. Because like I said, it was a really hot, muggy day. And then I just stood around for a little while watching everything on TV with everybody else. And finally one of the volunteers was leaving and they gave me a ride to my car and I got home. But, so I finally got home at maybe about 2 o'clock that afternoon. So it was about a 4-hour sojourn for me to finally get home.
That was an IFR weather, instrument weather. And 9/11 wasn't going on. So I told my wife, I don't know what's going on, but that was intentional. You don't do something like that unless it's intentional. And of course, a few minutes later, the other one happened. Well,
Yeah, September 11th was, I guess reflecting on it now, you hear a lot of people talk about the day. It was a beautiful day. It was a perfect fall day. It was just the kind of a day that I'm sure if you were a pilot, you would have loved to have gone up and be out there. For me, day started with preparation for the annual airfair that would have been the following week. I had to go out. Back then we went for a lot of advertising and just putting banners and signs out throughout the local roadways and the neighborhoods, and just letting people know just that the airfair was coming up and reminding them. And so my job that day was just getting out and hitting a lot of the neighborhood streets and community centers around here and getting a lot of literature out and putting some of those signs and posting them out through the neighborhoods. So at one point I was coming back through the airport early on, and one of the staff at the airport, Langston, had hollered out, because the operations was still in the old trailer at that time. It was prior to the current operations building being built. And Langston hollered out and said something's going on in New York. They had a television that they kept on during the day over there, and they had the Today Show running, and it was just at the time when I ran over to the trailer, and the second plane had just hit the second tower in New York. So up to that point, I think after the first one, people were just saying, was this an accident? What happened? Just the reality of that couldn't just happen. And unfortunately at that point, everything just started to unfold. I can remember getting back in the van then, because at that point nobody really knew what to think, and then the news started unfolding about where things were in Washington, the Pentagon, and then there were rumors out that a plane had actually hit at the Capitol, and like so many things that day, I think everybody was just it was all a blur. News was coming in and out just because of the sheer volume. People's cell calls were being dropped and people couldn't get through to loved ones, and I'm sure everything was just chaotic. It was just something that nobody would have expected, and people were just looking for answers and trying to find out, I think, what do we do next. The one thing I do remember just vividly is just then, as the news came through, what was actually happening, and we started hearing about planes being grounded, basically where they were, flights being discontinued, just the quiet, the airspace, just things you would take for granted, just commercial jets, anything flying, and you didn't hear that. You just didn't hear anything. In the evening, you would hear military planes that would obviously doing what they had to do. But yeah, just don't hear or see any commercial aircraft, anything, the airspace. You almost just take it for granted.
I was gonna say, it's gotta be weird, like, obviously I was 8 when this happened. I think it would be weird if
Flight patterns that crisscross, as you said, from many different airports, and just nothing. And it was really eerie, and just knowing, and just, I guess was at that point figuring out what had actually happened and where we went from there. And I think that was the uncertainty of all of it. Just a sense of innocence that something like that could have happened and did happen. And where we moved on from there, which was obviously, as we see to this day, security restrictions and different rules in place to this day.
If you recall, the FAA said all planes are grounded, period. If you're flying, you land. No matter where you are, you land. Because they didn't know what the heck was going on. And eventually, as time went on, then they figured out what had happened. And they instituted, as you know, in effect today, the huge security measures that they have at major airports now. And then the question came up, what do we do about these little planes? They're free to fly all over the place. And they could be carrying bombs. One of the things that they had to consider was the fact that general aviation at that time brought in over 150, I got to check my figures here. 150 billion dollars per year to the economy. And yet, how are we going to control these things? What's to stop a terrorist getting a 2-engine plane and loading it up and then flying it into the White House? And so there was a lot of talk about banning little planes. Unfortunately, an organization that most pilots belong to, and I certainly did for 30-some years, the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, acronym AOPA, was staunchly opposed to shutting down general aviation and working with the government to fashion a plan that would work for everybody and still be safe. And I give AOPA an awful lot of credit.
Now we come to 2001. 2001, we were, I don't know how many planes were on the field at the time, but I'm sure still a lot. And maybe even we still had a waiting list. I cannot tell you, and I'm sure they don't know across the street. All flying was banned by the FAA. You could not take off. That was obviously in September of 2001. After a month, the FAA and the powers that be, TSA, well, TSA didn't exist, I don't think, at the time, but whoever was in charge besides the FAA, the military, because they were responsible for keeping the area safe and shooting bad guys down if they were trying to get downtown again. They came up with what they called the flush out. And if you wanted to leave the field, you told the airport manager, and they put you on a list. And then sometime after that, you were allowed to take off and leave the field. But you were told if you didn't take off then, you didn't know when. I think between 5 and 10, who said, we are staying. Because if we all leave, they just might close the field. In February of 2002, and we did not fly for all those months. The airport was kept operational because there used to be fixed-wing traffic planes that used to fly around Washington and do airborne traffic reporting from the air. There used to be a plane based here, but it had left by then. But there are still some guys operating out of Gaithersburg, Montgomery County Airport. They were under contract with a county and were considered part of the police. The police could fly inside what is now known as the, what is the latest name for our area here?
The SFRA? SFRA?
SFRA. It had, we've gone through three
FRC,
names.
I think. At one
Special Flight Rules Area.
ADIZ or something?
ADIZ, we were protected by an ADIZ. Anyway, they had come up with some rules. And they said that, so they landed here every day. So that the airport had a fixed wing operation. So the airport remained operational.
I actually lobbied with 2 other guys. We went to Annapolis and lobbied for this very building because we didn't have a building. We had another one across the way here where the gas tank is. And it was only just a routine, I guess you would call it a trailer of some sort. That's how humble we were. And then in 1998, the funds were created to open this place. And we then began this great journey that we have here. We had as many as 40, 50,000 people coming through here during the year. And I was with the other 2 guys. We were all members of the Field of First, presidents of the Field of First also. And we were able to line up just before 9/11 occurred, a trip that would go to Europe. And we went to the Paris Air Show, as well as the one across the Channel in England. We rode the Channel too, which was something not a novelty at the time. The underwater a tunnel that occurred at the time. And we generated $12,000 from that trip. And that got the Field of First really moving in the right direction. Unfortunately, right after that, people were leery about going to Europe. Consequently, we couldn't get the vast numbers. And all we could get maybe a dozen, 15, 20 people at the most. But we did make some money out of the project. And I think we've had 8 trips abroad. Some of them failed. We couldn't get enough people. Still, folks were upset about traveling by plane across the ocean. Fairs that we had one regularly every year. And we sold soda and things like that, water and such like that, made money. And I flew in one of those air shows. I was in the back seat of a Cessna 240. The other air show that we had, I guess it was 2009. It was the 100th anniversary of the museum and the airfield. Not so much the museum, but the airfield. And that was under heavy security because there was still a concern about various people that were prowling about here. These people who destroyed the buildings in New York and hit the Pentagon, they actually were here. And I think when they found out they couldn't rent an airplane here, they tried going over to Montgomery Air Park and then went over to Tipton Airfield. And they decided on whatever a plan, which I don't remember. But they stayed up in Laurel, Maryland. And they stayed in a hotel there, and they used to come down, and they were speaking in Farsi during some of the lunch periods that we had at the Laurel Mall. But then they broke up, and some went to Boston, others went to New York, and they got their assignments to hit the different targets.
It's crazy.
Anyway, the last air show that we had, we were hoping to have one, and that was the 100th anniversary of airmail, because the airmail started here on an experimental basis. I think in one of the galleries, we had it over there. It's on the last remember over there. And the idea was that we were going to bring in a Jenny Curtis J4N, and the guy had mechanical problems and he couldn't make it here. This is one of the crown jewels of Prince George's County. We set up tours for kids. One of the last things we were trying to do before the pandemic hit, we were trying to get up some money so that we could build a trailer. We could put an airplane. We had an aircraft bar down near the helicopters down there, and we were going to take the wings off it and make it as an instruction type device. And we were going to go to the schools, because a lot of schools couldn't get the money to bring the kids in here. There were all kinds of bureaucratic problems from the Board of Education that is here in this county. So that never got off the ground. We had to come up with a king-size amount of money. We couldn't do that. In fact, we tried another tour to Europe, and we got about 8 people, and we bagged it because that's not enough.
But the rules were really draconian. If you wanted to fly here, first of all, you had to go through a vetting process, which is a security clearance process. You had to give them your name, your address, your social security number, a bunch of stuff that basically they checked to make sure you weren't on any list, you didn't have a criminal record. They had a long list of things you could not have done or you couldn't get in. You could not have had an FAA violation of penetrating what the FAA calls prohibited airspace, which still exists and existed then, like you can't fly over the White House. And there's other places around the country like that, and that's prohibited. And if you'd done that, you could not get vetted. So we went through that process. Then they went and they checked all that stuff out. And everybody that passed that vetting, we went down to close to Hyde Field. Are you familiar with Hyde? Okay. there's a high school down near there where 301 and 5 sort of come together. It's in the V, and I don't remember any more the name, where we had an absolutely enthralling 2-hour lecture on what we could and could not do. So then they issued us our cards, which had our PIN information on it. That allowed us to fly. But, and I think there were 100 and some people that had gone through the process out of however many we had here. Plus, there were a few clubs on the field, like Free State Flying Club is still here. And they were limited to 15 members at the time. And so I don't know if all of them got vetted, but so let's just say it's 120, 130 people. But in order to fly, in order to keep us all safe from people flying in and doing bad things, they had levels of threat levels. And it started down in green, which we never heard about. We were and had red, which we never had, thank God, and they're coming. But we had orange, which is high. They're hearing crap that they're concerned about, and we had the yellow. All right, and I don't remember whether orange or yellow was higher, but if we were at the lower threat level to fly, we had stationed on the field, and I don't remember, I think TSA may have existed by then, but I wouldn't swear by it. But there was some law enforcement type person on the field when the airport was open. They had to inspect your plane and go out to your plane with you to make sure you were not doing anything bad, like carrying a bomb out and throwing the plane. Or if you had a passenger with you, they would go with you. You were saying the passenger was safe, but you had to be a better pilot to fly. But before you flew, you had to call in and file a flight plan, say where you were going, and you had 20 minutes from the time you filed to get into the air, which is a tight schedule unless you did all your pre-flight work first and then walked out to your plane, and because there's time on the ground, you've probably seen planes running up and stuff like that. That part was coming back. You had to land either at Tipton, Fort Meade, or at Leonapolis, where you would be inspected again. Oh, and you had to file another flight plan to come back. And you had to land at one of these two places where and when you landed at College Park, you had to get on the phone and say, hey, I've landed at College Park. I'm sure they saw us land, but it was just, you had to do it. So it was a major, major pain. Like restricted zone, but they're inside the, I'll just use the term, the ADAs. Because we had the outer and the inner. We're in the inner. They could fly and had to file flight plans, but they didn't have to go through all the other stuff. They didn't have people there inspecting their planes and stuff like that. They just had to file a flight plan. In the past, we could just come out, when I worked at Lytton over here, at lunchtime I could walk over here, jump in a plane and go flying. I didn't have to talk to anybody. I just couldn't go downtown without permission. We used to, if you had somebody visiting, we could say, hey, would you like to see downtown? Yes, I would. Get in a plane, you take off, you would call Washington Tower. I'd like to do a downtown tour. Are you familiar? Yes, okay. Proceed to the stadium. Yeah, RFK. Proceed to the stadium, and along the way they turn you over to the tower. The tower would say, are you familiar? Yes. Proceed around, there's prohibited airspace, so you had to fly around it. But you could go basically down to the stadium, then up the river, towards the airport, towards National, then hang a right, and go around the prohibited airspace and fly back to College Park. And that was all you did. That has gone away and has never come back. But, so anyway, people did not want to deal with these restrictions. So, a number of the airports around here had allowed the people that had been based here to come, and they gave discounts on tie downs and stuff like that. But we may have had 10 or 15 planes come back at that time. And I don't remember the real number, but it was very few. And then now we're up to about 40. And I don't think we've ever gone much above 45. Now, we no longer have to deal with all the other stuff, but, oh, yeah. We got vetted by coming out to the airport, Secret Service, FAA, and some other organization. Maybe TSA had started to exist by then. They are the ones that we had to talk to and fill out paperwork for. After that was over, in order to get vetted, you had to go down only to National Airport, to TSA down there, for your fingerprints. Then you had to go to Baltimore and talk to the FAA up there to go through their process. So now imagine you want to come to this airport just to fly in, and you were based at Gaithersburg, or you're moving into the area, and you were told all this crap. You don't want to do it, so you went to one of our outlying airports. And we were having discussions about changing of the rules. Many members of the Friends of the Airport would go out in the neighborhood and sort of solicit comments. And I'll never forget, one day somebody came back and said, you know, I was up in Yarrow, and I'm trying to explain what we were looking for. And are you annoyed by the noise of the airport, was one of the questions. And whoever was living in the house said, do we have an airport? It's gotten much better. And there's a city has an airport authority, which does its best to keep the city informed about what's going on, and does its best to protect the airport from incursions of building around the airport.
Well, I think for me, I used the term earlier about that age of innocence or the loss of freedoms per se. I think we took a lot of that for granted, and I think for us it was where do we move from here. Obviously the airfare, which would have been the following week, was canceled. Like many things, we had to adjust around what we could or couldn't do because of ourselves, College Park Airport and others within the general Washington Beltway area that fell under the same restrictions. And I think the folks in aviation here at College Park and some of those other Potomac, Highfield, some of those other airports were tasked with what do we do and where do we go from here, what we're allowed to do. There were regulations in place. I think we were concerned that obviously being the world's oldest continuously operated airport, what that meant for us. We were able to have vetted pilots, both military, I believe, or police, helicopters and the like, and also other pilots that probably had some connection in the government that were able to help us along by making takeoff and landing here and keep that going. Not only probably for themselves out of a convenience because we were here. People that used the airport prior to 9/11 were probably just as amazed and figuring out what they needed to do to adjust their lives around all of that. I think that was the biggest thing, was just the uncertainty, where we moved on, how we moved on, how long it would last, because I think at that point, once we started seeing these restrictions go into place, it was just not knowing and how that would ultimately impact us as the airport. But for us, not knowing if there was that likelihood that we could be closed, and then where that left us as a tourist destination, as a museum, which hadn't been open in our current capacity in the new building, but for a few years at that point. We took great pride in that. The museum was something special, it still is, but it's something that had a lot of things to show the public, all our visitors here. We had quite a group through our special events that we were learning to kind of formulate around, what worked, what didn't work, our visitation, school groups, everything. And I think there was just a general concern of if something happened where it would restrict a lot of that or close the airport, would we still be the same draw, what we'd have to do. So yeah, I just think that uncertainty there was probably a big part of where we were going to move on and how long it would last. Yeah.
Request permission. You do it nicely. Yeah, this is Bonanza 80 Zulu, entering the traffic area from the north. We'd like to land on runway 31. And then they would say back, okay, maintain position and follow the flight pattern. You're cleared for runway such and such. And then when you landed and you want to take off, you sit there and contact the control tower and ask permission to take the runway, and then they do. And this is in fairly major airports. Places like Freeway, or College Park, what you do, you call in and announce your intentions. I'm downwind on runway 31. Landing at College Park. So everybody in the sky around here knows that you're in the pattern. And it's much safer that way. And I gotta admit, I had to study it for a long, long time before. This is part of it, and I'm going to leave the maps with you. I talked to the guy at the gentleman that was on duty at Freeway the other day, and I thought, well, let's see. I understand that you can't fly into DC without this. Maybe they might let you through, or maybe go around and this sort of thing. I said, but if I'm going to Ocean City, can't I just take off from here and go to Ocean City? Not anymore. You have to be cleared to go to the portal. And I said, I've never heard that name before. What is the portal? It's the designated place that you must exit this section if you want to go east. There are portals north, there are portals south and west, and there's a whole scheme of things that I have never heard of. And I confess my ignorance, and I look at this map nowadays, and I think to myself, how did we ever do it before? You know, it used to be so simple. It was functional, but you know, we have these bags load. Okay, make sure the tags are on. But there was no X-ray, nothing like that at all. One of my daughters wanted to give my wife and I guess it was the 35th wedding anniversary or something like that. So she arranged a flight from DC to Hawaii. It was so wonderful. But You're in bags, put them on the plane, no X-ray. They'll be waiting for you, etc. Well, we flew to California. She lives in California, and then we left from California. And just unforgettable. And no question of security. They might ask you, do you have any liquids in there that might spill, like a liquid or something like that. But they would not go through your luggage. They wouldn't pull a piece off and X-ray it. I mean, it was just, okay, we're loaded, let's go. So different.
Did they,
It's quite involved. I don't think I'm going step by step with her through it, but they certainly want to know who you are. And they check that constantly. And they run background checks on people if they have a slightest suspicion that something may not quite be right. And some people are not allowed to fly because of questionable lineage somewhere, somehow. And everything is really tight. And boy, they go through your luggage. And we often, my daughter's going to go flying back to California. We'll stay and watch her go through the line. And sometimes it takes 45 minutes for her to get to the place where they're going to put everything down and X-ray it and so forth. And we normally go to BWI. And it's quite a tedious process.
We all know now the things of traveling, commercial airlines, all the things that we have to go through for our own safety now, but things that before, going through metal detectors at the airport prior to 9/11, but things that we now, what you could or couldn't bring on board, and all the things that are obviously put in place after 9/11. Once again, a sort of an age of innocence, something that we took for granted before and just no longer there. So I think we all know now that obviously with things that are in place, or anybody who's flown recently, or at least since 9/11, knows that the carrying liquid and just taking your shoes off and going through the different scanners, body scanners, and the different detectors. Back then, it was you kind of passed through, for lack of another term, just a metal detector, and you went through and would see if you had anything, firearm or any other kind of weapon. But
Did they check like IDs at all, or as long as you had like a plane ticket, you were?
yeah, I mean, you could get on board, and then you had your boarding pass and you had your ticket. You could get in, and the one thing which I think a lot of families, unfortunately, what we think about and missing out on is the ability to say goodbye to your loved ones at the gate as they're boarding a plane, because prior to that, you could go through all that security, which was in place, but being able to wait there for that person to actually board and get through that level of security versus now where you don't get any further than basically you're out in the front areas and local goes down into their area before your first levels of security that you pass through at any given airport. So that was interesting, saying, oh yeah, I can't do that anymore. So yeah, one of many. Another large one would have been that in 2009, following for our 100th anniversary of the field here, following 2008, which was at Fort Myer over in Virginia. So it was sort of a continuation of their anniversary, which led into our anniversary here for the 100th anniversary here at College Park.
Was that mainly like in the museum, or was there stuff?
'09 was a pretty good sized event. Fortunately, we were able to work around and work with the folks, you know, in local law enforcement, MAA, FAA, everybody who had any form of security, everything that was required at that time. Because even though we were several years past 2011, I'm sorry, 2001, past 2001, we were able to go through and get the clearance that we needed for that day to at least hold a reasonable version of what we could conceivably get, you know, to celebrate the celebration here at the museum and at the airport itself, which was, you know, for 100 years. Pretty big event, but we had quite a few people here. It was open to the public, pretty large size group, pretty comparable to what we would have had on for one of our airfares, but obviously a smaller, less the actual air flights or things that were going on at the time. The actual air show.
So no, like,
It was a lot more subdued, I think, just for things that they were able to get. We were able to get folks to come in and land and show off their aircraft there on the field, but we still had, even that many years later, we still had to go through quite a few restrictions and things that were in place just to make sure for security purposes. So one more of the unfortunate sides of where we were, where we still are in some ways with a lot of things that I think we just took for granted. I think we just thought that those things would always be available to us, and like so many other things. But unfortunately, we did the best, and we still had a pretty good time. And I know, you know, gauging from the crowd and the folks that were here, it was a nice event that we were able to do. So.
I don't know if it'll ever be like it used to be, but we can work in that direction. I think airports ought to be more open to people who want to see what an airport is really like. They need to learn about the benefits of being able to fly personal planes. Believe me, I don't think I'm an expert on anything in aviation, except that I like it so much. I think AOPA is trying to do a lot of education programs, and thank God that they are still interested in getting people to join into general aviation. And with organizations like that trying hard, I'm hoping for a decent measure of success.